He was 73 years old when he died. In a country where the average man did not survive past 40, in a century when war, plague, famine, and the sheer physical brutality of political life killed most powerful men before they reached 50, in a world where the people who surrounded him, the generals, the advisors, the rivals he outlasted one by one, died of sword wounds and poisoning and mysterious fevers, and, in more than a few cases, simply of the consequences of how they had lived. Tokugawa Ieyasu died in his bed, of natural causes, at 73, and before he died, he had fathered children past the age of 60. He had personally mixed his own medicines for decades. He had watched the dietary habits of everyone around him with the focused attention of a man who understood, long before the science existed to explain it, that what you put into your body was not a minor detail. It was the foundation of everything else. This is the story of how the most powerful man in Japanese history ate, slept, moved, and lived, and why what he knew in the 16th century, which the people around him largely ignored, the science of the 21st century, is only now fully confirming. But to understand why Ieyasu's choices were remarkable, you first have to understand what was killing everyone else. In the year 1600, Edo was a city transforming at a speed that no city in Japan had ever experienced. Tokugawa Ieyasu had just won the Battle of Sekigahara, the largest battle in Japanese history, and was in the process of consolidating power over a country that had been at war with itself for over a century. People were flooding into Edo from every direction. Samurai looking for employment, merchants following the money, craftsmen following the merchants, farmers leaving the countryside for the opportunities of the city. Within 2 generations, Edo would become one of the largest cities in the world, and with the people came a disease that nobody understood. It began in the feet, a tingling, then numbness, then a strange weakness in the legs that made walking difficult and stairs nearly impossible. The heart would begin to beat irregularly. The legs would swell, the breathing would become labored, and then in many cases death, sometimes quickly, sometimes after months of slow deterioration that was as confusing to the physicians trying to treat it as it was terrible for the person experiencing it. The Japanese called it kakke, and kakke was everywhere in Edo. What made it genuinely baffling was its distribution. It was not random. It tracked with wealth. The samurai class suffered disproportionately. The upper merchant families suffered. The wealthy households of the city suffered. The poor farmers in the surrounding countryside, eating whatever they could find, and scratching out survival on the margins of the agricultural economy, barely suffered at all. Physicians looked at this pattern and concluded, reasonably but incorrectly, that kakke must have something to do with the stress and moral corruption of urban life, that it was a disease of civilization, that people were being punished in some medical, if not quite divine sense, for the excesses of prosperity. They were right about the prosperity. They were wrong about the mechanism. The real answer was sitting in the rice bowl. In Edo, Japan, the quality of rice you ate announced your social position as clearly as the clothes you wore, or the size of your household. White rice, polished white, gleaming and smooth and completely stripped of its outer bran layer, was the rice of the prosperous. It was expensive to process, it looked beautiful, it tasted mild and clean, and it had been systematically stripped of something the human body cannot survive without: vitamin B1, thiamine. The bran layer of rice, the brown outer coating that is removed to make white rice, contains essentially all of the grain's thiamine. Remove the bran, you remove the thiamine. The wealthy ate white rice because white rice was what wealthy people ate. The farmers ate brown rice, or rice mixed with barley and millet and whatever else they could grow, because they could not afford the processing. And the farmers, entirely by accident, were consuming the one nutrient that kept kakke away. Tokugawa Ieyasu knew none of this in biochemical terms. The word thiamine did not exist. The concept of vitamins would not be developed for another 300 years. But he knew something that the people dying around him had forgotten or chosen to ignore, which was that the food the common people ate kept them alive through things that killed the aristocracy. He ate rice mixed with barley every day, not because he could not afford white rice. He could have had the finest polished rice in Japan brought to his table at every meal. He ate the mixed grain because he had observed, with the same careful attention he applied to military strategy, that the people who ate the simple food tended to remain standing longer than the people who ate the elaborate food. This was the first principle of Ieyasu's relationship with food, and it is the one that modern nutritional science has spent decades working its way back toward. Eat what keeps the body functional, not what announces your status. Eat like someone who needs to keep going, not like someone who has already arrived. He started every morning the same way, with a consistency that his attendants found almost monotonous, because the people who served powerful men were accustomed to powerful men wanting variety and novelty and the constant stimulation of new flavors and elaborate preparation. Ieyasu wanted none of this. He wanted his breakfast to be the same breakfast it was yesterday, and the same breakfast it would be tomorrow, and he regarded anyone who felt differently about morning meals with the mild impatience of someone watching a perfectly functional ship being made unnecessarily complicated. The breakfast was this: barley rice, miso soup, but not the thin, pale miso soup that many people think of when they hear the words miso soup. This was hacho miso, a paste made from soybeans, fermented for a minimum of 3 years, sometimes 5, in massive cedar barrels under the weight of river stones, developing over that time into something almost black in color, intensely salty, so dense and complex in flavor that a single spoon of it was enough to transform a bowl of plain water into something substantial. Hacho miso specifically comes from the Okazaki region of Aichi Prefecture, which happens to be where Tokugawa Ieyasu was born and spent his childhood. He had eaten it his entire life. He continued eating it until he died. His physician recorded it regularly in the medical notes he kept about the shogun's health, apparently as a relevant dietary fact worth documenting. Modern nutritional research has been extremely kind to hacho miso. The long fermentation process produces beneficial bacteria in quantities that shorter fermented misos do not achieve. It contains significant amounts of protein, manganese, copper, and vitamin K2. And unlike many fermented foods that lose their probiotic properties when heated, the strains produced in long fermented miso retain more stability than their short fermented equivalents. Ieyasu did not know any of this. He just knew that he had been eating it his whole life and was still alive and functioning when men his age were not supposed to be alive and functioning. After the miso came the pickles, tsukemono. Every single meal included something fermented or pickled, usually several things: daikon radish pickled in rice bran, cucumber in salt, and most importantly, most consistently, the small wrinkled reddish-brown fruit that Ieyasu regarded almost as medicine rather than food: umeboshi. Plums are a fruit technically closer to an apricot than to any plum that grows in the West. They are harvested before they are ripe, while still intensely sour, and then preserved in salt for months, sometimes with red shiso leaves that give them their characteristic crimson color. The result is something that assaults the mouth with simultaneous sourness and saltiness of an intensity that makes first-time tasters physically recoil. The Japanese have a tradition of placing a single umeboshi in the center of a white rice bowl, a visual representation of the Japanese flag, which is entirely accurate as a symbol and gives you absolutely no warning about what the umeboshi actually tastes like. Ieyasu ate them every morning. He spoke about them in terms that his attendants recorded in their notes about his household habits, crediting them with keeping his digestion clean and his energy consistent. He distributed them to his soldiers on campaign, apparently having concluded that an army whose stomachs were functioning correctly was an army that could march further and fight harder than one that was dealing with the dysentery and intestinal infections that routinely decimated military forces in an era before refrigeration and sanitation. He was not wrong. Umeboshi contains significant concentrations of citric acid, which creates an inhospitable environment for several of the bacterial strains responsible for food poisoning and stomach infections. They are alkalizing despite their acidic taste, shifting the body's pH in ways that inhibit the growth of pathogens, and they stimulate the production of digestive enzymes and bile in ways that improve the absorption of nutrients from the other food in the meal. A Japanese military campaign in the 16th century was an exercise in managing the logistics of keeping large numbers of men adequately fed and healthy over weeks or months in field conditions. The army with the better gut bacteria had a genuine strategic advantage. Fish was the center of every significant meal, not as an occasional variation from a meat-based diet, because the Buddhist restrictions of the period meant that beef, pork, and most land animals were officially prohibited for most of the population most of the time. Fish was the primary animal protein of Japanese civilization, but there was enormous variation in how fish were consumed, and Ieyasu's preferences within that variation are worth noting. He preferred whole fish over processed or dried fish when it was available. He liked fatty fish. He was particularly fond of tai, the red sea bream, a firm-fleshed saltwater fish with enough fat in its flesh to have a rich flavor without being heavy. He ate small fish whole, including the bones, which provided calcium that most of his contemporaries were not getting from dairy, because dairy was essentially absent from the traditional Japanese diet. His physicians noted that he ate slowly. This is documented in multiple places in the household records, apparently because it was unusual enough in a man of his power and busyness to be worthy of note. The standard approach to meals for a busy military and political leader was efficiency. You ate quickly because you had things to do. Ieyasu ate slowly, chewed thoroughly, and did not conduct political business during meals if he could avoid it. Again, he did not have the language of cortisol and parasympathetic activation and digestive enzyme production to explain why this mattered. But he had observed, over a lifetime of watching people's health deteriorate, that the men who ate fastest and worried hardest seemed to break down soonest. The thing that most distinguished Ieyasu's relationship with food from his contemporaries was not any single item he ate. It was his active engagement with the subject as something worth serious intellectual attention. He did not delegate his health to his physicians and then forget about it. He studied medicine himself, to a level of sophistication that impressed the actual physicians who served him. He maintained a room in his castle devoted to the preparation of medicines, where he personally compounded herbal remedies using formulations he had studied from Chinese medical texts that had been in Japan for centuries. He prepared medicines not only for himself, but for members of his household and his generals. This was considered extremely unusual behavior for a man of his rank, which is precisely why it appears so frequently in the historical record. Several of his generals received medicines from his hand, a gesture that combined genuine care with the implicit political message that the shogun was watching over the health of the men who served him. His medical knowledge drew heavily on the Chinese system of traditional medicine that had been influencing Japanese practice for centuries. This system had a sophisticated understanding of food as medicine, of different foods having different effects on different organ systems, and of the body as a system in dynamic balance that could be supported or disrupted by what it was given to consume. The categories of this system do not map perfectly onto modern nutritional science, but the practical recommendations that emerge from it, when evaluated against what we now know about nutrition, are often surprisingly accurate. The kidneys in this system were considered the source of fundamental life energy, the deep reserves that sustained long-term vitality and the capacity to remain vigorous into old age. Kidney-supporting foods were therefore foods that supported longevity and what we might call reproductive vitality. And the recommendations for kidney support are a list that reads almost like a summary of the foods associated with hormonal health in current nutritional research. Black sesame seeds appeared on this list, and Ieyasu ate them. Roasted, usually, and sprinkled over rice or incorporated into small preparations. Black sesame is rich in zinc, which is one of the most important minerals for testosterone production. It contains lignans that support hormone metabolism, and it provides sesamin and sesamolin, compounds that reduce inflammation and have mild antioxidant effects that protect against the kind of cellular damage that accumulates with age. Oysters and shellfish appeared on this list, and when they were available, Ieyasu consumed them. Oysters contain more zinc per gram than virtually any other food on Earth. A single large oyster can contain more than the recommended daily allowance of zinc for an adult male. Zinc is not a minor nutritional consideration for hormonal health. It is a rate-limiting factor in testosterone synthesis. Without adequate zinc, the enzymatic processes that produce testosterone cannot operate at full capacity, regardless of whatever else might be going well in the body. The Chinese physicians who recommended oysters for kidney support did not know about zinc or testosterone as chemical compounds. But they had observed, over centuries of clinical practice, that men who consumed shellfish regularly tended to maintain their vigor longer, and they recorded this in the texts that Ieyasu studied. Reishi mushroom appeared on this list, under the Japanese name reishi, also called manentake, the 10,000-year mushroom, which gives you a clear indication of what its users believed about its relationship to longevity. Ieyasu drank reishi tea regularly. Reishi, in the research that has accumulated over the past several decades, is one of the better-studied traditional medicinal mushrooms. It contains compounds that modulate the immune system, reduce inflammation, lower cortisol levels, and have adaptogenic effects that help the body manage the biological consequences of chronic stress. The reduction of cortisol is particularly relevant to hormonal health because cortisol and testosterone are physiological rivals. When cortisol goes up, testosterone tends to go down. A man in a position of enormous power, managing constant political pressure, military threats, and the administrative demands of governing a newly unified nation, was a man whose cortisol was under constant pressure to rise. Reishi did not eliminate stress, but it may have blunted the hormonal consequences of it. Shiitake mushrooms, which were considerably more available than reishi and not considered medicinal in the same rarefied sense, appeared at Ieyasu's table regularly and were dried in direct sunlight before use. This practice, which was standard in Japanese cuisine, has an effect that was completely unknown until modern nutritional science investigated it. Drying shiitake mushrooms in direct sunlight activates a compound in the mushroom tissue that is converted, by ultraviolet radiation, into vitamin D. The dried mushrooms store this vitamin D and release it when consumed. In a country where people spent significant portions of the year indoors, or in climates where sun exposure was limited, sun-dried shiitake mushrooms were a meaningful dietary source of a nutrient that is critical for immune function, bone density, mood regulation, and hormonal health, all of which vitamin D deficiency impairs in ways that manifest over years and decades rather than suddenly. Now, let us be direct about the part of Ieyasu's story that his historical record documents in some detail, and that speaks most clearly to the effectiveness, or at least the extraordinary nature, of how he maintained his physical capacity over the course of his life. Tokugawa Ieyasu had 19 formally recognized wives and concubines, 19 women who entered into the structured household arrangements that governed the domestic lives of powerful men in Edo, Japan. Arrangements that were simultaneously domestic, political, and dynastic in their purpose. He fathered children by 11 of them. His last recorded child was born when he was 62 years old. In a modern context, this would be considered unusual but not impossible. In the context of 16th and early 17th century Japan, where men of any social class rarely survived into their 60s at all, where the physical demands of the preceding century of civil war had broken most bodies long before they reached that age, where the medical care available for age-related conditions was essentially limited to herbal preparations and prayer, this was genuinely remarkable, and it was documented not because it was unremarkable, but precisely because it was not. The large household was not primarily about desire or indulgence, and anyone who interprets it through that lens is missing the actual point of the arrangement. In a dynastic system, producing male heirs was a political necessity so urgent that the failure to do so had ended dynasties, started wars, and destroyed political settlements that had taken generations to build. Having multiple women in the household was structural insurance against the biological uncertainties of reproduction. You needed sons. You needed multiple sons, because sons died of disease and injury and war. And you needed the capacity to keep producing them across the span of a political career that might last decades. Maintaining that capacity into one's 60s required a body that had not been destroyed by the usual habits of powerful men in that era. War injuries, heavy drinking, the sedentary life that affluence encouraged, the rich food that prosperity made available, the chronic stress of political violence that elevated cortisol for years on end. Most men with Ieyasu's level of political engagement were physiologically old before they were chronologically old. Ieyasu, by all available evidence, was not. The sleep habits that his attendants recorded are worth noting here. He went to bed early by the standards of his class and his time. Court life in powerful Japanese households often ran late into the night, with the entertainment, the political maneuvering over sake cups, the elaborate rituals of hospitality that cemented alliances and subtly communicated power. Ieyasu participated in these occasions when political necessity required it and left them when it did not. His attendants recorded that he did not apologize for early departures. He simply left. Sleep is not a passive state. During sleep, the human body produces the majority of its daily output of growth hormone, testosterone, and several other hormones that regulate tissue repair, immune function, and metabolic health. Men who chronically undersleep have measurably lower testosterone levels than men who sleep adequately. The relationship is not subtle and it is not slow. A single week of sleeping 5 hours a night reduces testosterone levels by an amount equivalent to 10 to 15 years of normal aging. This finding, from research conducted at the University of Chicago in the 21st century, would not have surprised a physician who had spent decades observing that the men who stayed up late drinking tended to age faster than the men who went to bed. The physical activity deserves attention too. Ieyasu practiced falconry throughout his life into old age. Falconry in the context of feudal Japan was not a gentle hobby. It involved walking over rough terrain in search of game birds, frequently at pace and for hours, over hills and through fields and along river margins that required genuine physical effort to navigate. It required the maintenance of enough strength and balance and reflexes to handle a large bird of prey, to move quickly when necessary, and to manage the physical demands of extended outdoor activity. He had practiced martial arts from childhood, as all samurai did, but he maintained a physical discipline into later life that went beyond the ceremonial. His physicians noted that he remained capable of significant physical exertion well past the age when most men of his rank had become sedentary, carried by palanquin, and surrounded by the soft immobility that power makes available to those who want it. Ieyasu wanted none of that softness. He had spent too many years watching it kill people. Now compare all of this to what was happening at the other end of the social spectrum. In the villages and farming communities that produced the rice and vegetables and fish that fed the entire society above them. The average farm family in Edo, Japan, ate in ways that would look, to a modern nutritionist, surprisingly coherent, not because they had nutritional knowledge, but because they had no alternative. Breakfast was typically thin rice porridge, kayu, made from whatever grain was available, and stretched with water to feed more people than the grain could strictly support. This was consumed with whatever pickled vegetables the household had prepared from the previous harvest, maybe some dried sardines, maybe miso if the household produced it. The midday meal, eaten in the field, was usually cold rice or barley formed into balls, onigiri, maybe wrapped in a dried seaweed leaf. Simple, portable, functional. The evening meal was the most substantial of the day, and was when the household's protein, usually fish or dried fish, or occasionally tofu, made its appearance. Seasonal vegetables, either fresh or preserved, accompanied everything. In coastal areas, seaweed was a regular part of the diet, providing iodine and a suite of minerals that inland populations often lacked. This diet was deficient in calories by modern standards. Farm families in bad years were genuinely hungry. In famine years, people died. But the foods that were eaten were nutritionally dense relative to their caloric content. Brown and mixed grain rice provided B vitamins. Small fish eaten whole provided calcium and omega-3 fatty acids. Fermented and pickled vegetables provided beneficial bacteria and preserved the nutritional content of seasonal produce across the months when fresh food was unavailable. Seaweed provided iodine, which is critical for thyroid function and metabolic health. The diseases that were emptying the hospitals and wealthy households of Edo were largely absent in these farm communities. Not because poverty protects you from disease in any general sense. Poverty kills in many ways, but the specific deficiency diseases, the kakke, and the scurvy-adjacent conditions that tracked with aristocratic diets were filtered out of the farming population by the simple fact that their restricted diet, in stripping away the elaborate processing that made aristocratic food look beautiful, happened to retain the nutritional components that the elaborate processing removed. The intermediate class, the merchants and artisans and urban workers of the growing Edo economy, occupied a complicated dietary position. They had more money than farmers, and therefore more choice. But they also had access to more variety of food, and they spent their greater income on a wider range of ingredients rather than simply on more expensive versions of the same simple foods. Tofu, which required processing, and therefore cost more than the soybeans it was made from, was a regular part of the urban merchant diet. It was available fresh from neighborhood makers who produced it daily and sold it from carts in the morning hours. It provided protein and calcium and isoflavones, compounds that interact with estrogen receptors in ways that have been the subject of considerable nutritional debate, but appear, at moderate consumption levels, to have anti-inflammatory and cardiovascular protective effects. Natto, the fermented whole soybean preparation that has the texture of something gone wrong and a smell that tends to divide first-time tasters into two permanent camps, was a staple of the urban working class and lower merchant population. It was cheap, shelf-stable, produced by small-scale fermenters throughout the city, and extremely nutritious. The fermentation process produces vitamin K2 in significant quantities, and natto remains one of the richest dietary sources of K2 known. Vitamin K2 is now understood to play important roles in cardiovascular health, bone density, and calcium metabolism that could not have been articulated in the 16th century, but were being promoted unknowingly every time a family in Edo sat down to a bowl of something stringy and pungent that they could actually afford. Interestingly, the consumption of natto showed a strong geographic pattern. The eastern regions of Japan, including the Edo area, ate significantly more natto than the western regions around Kyoto and Osaka. The Western aristocratic culture tended to regard natto as provincial food, too strongly flavored and too unprepossessing in appearance for refined tastes. The Eastern warrior culture ate it without apology. The historical longevity records for these two populations show a consistent advantage for the East, which may or may not be related to natto consumption, but is at minimum consistent with it. Green tea deserves a specific mention because it cuts across all social classes in Edo, Japan, in a way that few other foods or drinks did. Everyone drank tea. The very poor drank coarser, cheaper teas. The wealthy drank the finest powdered matcha, prepared with elaborate ceremony. But the plant was the same, and the compounds in the plant, the catechins and L-theanine, and various polyphenols that nutritional research has been investigating intensively for the past several decades, were present across all grades of the product. Green tea catechins, particularly the compound EGCG, have documented effects on inflammation, blood sugar regulation, fat metabolism, and cardiovascular health. L-theanine, an amino acid found almost exclusively in tea plants, modulates brain chemistry in ways that produce calm focus without sedation, reducing the subjective and biochemical experience of stress without impairing the alertness needed to function. In a population living under the chronic political, military, and economic pressures of Edo, Japan, the daily consumption of large quantities of a beverage that contained a compound specifically designed by evolution to make stress more manageable was not a minor consideration. Ieyasu drank tea throughout the day. He is not recorded as making anything particularly special of this, because nobody in his world made anything particularly special of daily tea consumption. It was simply what people did. Like breathing, there is a final element of Ieyasu's approach to health that is perhaps the most important and the most difficult to translate into a simple recommendation, because it is about orientation rather than any specific practice. He was curious about his own body in a way that powerful men rarely are, because powerful men rarely need to be. The standard position of a shogun in relation to medicine was to have physicians, to defer to those physicians, and to assume that being powerful enough to have the best physicians meant you were receiving the best care. Ieyasu did not take this position. He treated his physicians as colleagues whose knowledge supplemented rather than replaced his own. He asked questions. He read texts. He experimented on himself with preparations that he had read about or been told about, monitoring the results with the attention of a man who understood that he was the best positioned person to observe the effects. This approach would be recognized by modern practitioners of precision medicine, personalized nutrition, and quantified self-tracking as entirely sensible. It is exactly the orientation that produces the best health outcomes. Treat the information provided by experts as input to your own ongoing experiment, rather than as instructions to be followed without understanding. He also never fully trusted prosperity. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive element of his story. He had more resources available to him than any person in Japan. He could have eaten anything, drunk anything, lived in any degree of physical comfort that the civilization around him could produce, and he consistently chose not to avail himself of the full extent of that availability. He ate the mixed grain rice when white rice was available. He drank the tea when sake was flowing. He went to bed when the political entertainment was still ongoing. He chose, again and again, the option that looked like the lesser one, and that kept him functioning after the people who chose the greater option had stopped functioning. There is a phrase in the Japanese medical tradition that has been traced to approximately this period, though its exact origin is uncertain. Hara Hachibu. Eat until you are 80% full. It appears in Okinawan dietary practice and has been associated with the extraordinary longevity of Okinawan populations. But the principle appears throughout Japanese medical writing of the Edo period as a general recommendation for maintaining health. Stop before you are full. Leave the table with capacity remaining. Ieyasu's household records suggest that he ate in moderation by the standards of his class and time, which is to say that while his meals were adequate and sometimes elaborate by the standards of a farmer's table, they were restrained by the standards of what was available to him. The pattern of documented restraint, the early bedtimes, the walking when riding was available, the plain rice when elaborate dishes were offered, suggests a man who had internalized something very close to hara hachibu as a general life principle. Do not consume your full capacity. Leave something in reserve. The body that is always pushed to its limit does not have the reserves for the unexpected demands that life, in a century as violent and unpredictable as the late 16th century in Japan, would inevitably place on it. He died at 73 of stomach cancer, most likely related to his consumption of raw and lightly cured fish over a lifetime, an irony that any nutritionist would recognize as a reminder that no dietary pattern is a guarantee against everything. He had done almost everything right by the standards we would apply today. And then he was killed by the one thing he had not managed to identify as a risk, because the link between raw fish parasites and gastric cancer was not going to be understood for another 300 years. But he lived until 73. He fathered children at 62. He unified Japan, administered it for over a decade, and died with his dynasty intact and his succession secured. The men who opposed him, who ate more richly and drank more heavily and slept less and moved less, mostly did not survive to see what he built. When modern researchers study what they call the blue zones, the geographic regions of the world where people consistently live past 100, at rates far exceeding the global average, they find a convergent set of practices that have emerged independently in places as different as Sardinia and Okinawa and the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica. Plant-heavy diets. Moderate protein, primarily from fish and legumes rather than from red meat. Fermented foods as a regular part of the diet. Physical activity that is embedded in daily life rather than separated into discrete exercise sessions. Strong social connections, a sense of purpose that extends beyond personal pleasure. And consistently, what amounts to hara hachibu, eating to sufficiency rather than to capacity. Tokugawa Ieyasu was practicing a version of all of these things in a castle in Edo in the early 1600s, in a country that would not encounter the formal concept of the calorie for another 200 years, in a civilization that had no means of measuring vitamins, minerals, hormones, or any of the other biochemical markers that modern health science uses to evaluate what a body is doing and why. He was doing it because he paid attention, because he watched what the people who lived longest actually ate and how they actually moved and how they actually slept, because he treated his own body with the same strategic seriousness he applied to military campaigns and political negotiations, because he understood, in whatever terms were available to him, that the body is the instrument through which everything else in life is accomplished, and that an instrument maintained with care outlasts an instrument used without thought. The peasants in the fields outside Edo were eating brown rice and fermented vegetables and small whole fish, not because they had read the medical texts or understood the nutritional science. They were eating these things because it was what they had. And they were alive when the samurai eating polished white rice in the cities were dying of a deficiency disease that nobody understood. Sometimes the wisdom is not in the library. Sometimes it is in the bowl of the person who did not have a choice about what to put in the bowl. And sometimes the most powerful man in the country looks at that bowl and chooses it anyway because he is paying attention. That is the difference between living to 40 and living to 73, between a dynasty that collapses in a generation and one that rules for 250 years, between a body that is used up by power and one that is maintained by it. Eat like you need to keep going, because you do. To understand what 19 wives actually meant in the political machinery of the Tokugawa shogunate, you first have to discard every association the number might carry in a modern context, because the frame of reference is entirely wrong. In 16th and early 17th century Japan, the domestic arrangements of a powerful man were not a private matter. They were a public institution, managed with the same careful administrative attention as military logistics or tax collection, because they served the same essential function, keeping the system running without catastrophic failure. The catastrophic failure that everyone in the political world of Edo Japan feared was the failure of succession. A shogunate without a clear male heir was a shogunate that invited civil war. Japan had just spent over a century in exactly that condition, the Sengoku period, the era of warring states, in which the absence of stable central authority had produced generations of conflict that killed enormous numbers of people and devastated the agricultural economy that everyone depended on. Ieyasu had ended that era. He had unified the country. He had imposed stability with a combination of military force and political maneuvering of extraordinary sophistication. And he understood, with the clarity of a man who had lived through what instability actually looked like, that the single most important thing he could do to protect what he had built was to ensure that the question of who came after him had a clear and unambiguous answer. This required sons, multiple sons, because sons died of disease, of injury, of the various violent ends that awaited young men in a society that still conducted warfare and still had swords drawn in anger on a regular basis. The structure of his household reflected this strategic reality. His principal wife, Tsukiyama Dono, occupied the formal position of primary consort and the social role that came with it. She was the public face of the domestic arrangements, the woman whose position gave the household its official form. The other women, the concubines and lesser wives who made up the remaining 18, existed within a hierarchy that was understood, managed, and administered by a dedicated household staff, whose job was essentially to run a small bureaucracy of domestic political relationships. Each woman who entered this arrangement came with her own network of family connections. Each child she bore added a thread to the web of obligations and alliances that held the Tokugawa political system together. When Ieyasu arranged marriages for his children, he was simultaneously cementing relationships with the regional lords, the daimyo, whose cooperation was essential to the stability of the central government. A daughter married into a powerful regional family was a bond. A son raised as a Tokugawa heir, who also carried the blood of a regional lord's daughter, was a double bond. The capacity to keep producing children, to keep adding threads to this web, was therefore not separable from the capacity to govern. A shogun who had exhausted his reproductive vitality in his 40s or 50s was a shogun whose political options narrowed with each passing year. Ieyasu, by fathering his last recorded child at 62, maintained those options well past the point where most men of his era and social position had lost them entirely. His contemporaries in this regard make instructive comparisons. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man Ieyasu served before eventually succeeding him as the dominant power in Japan, was arguably the most militarily successful leader Japan had produced in centuries. He had conquered the country. He had launched invasions of Korea. He had rebuilt Osaka Castle into the largest fortified structure in Japan. And he was, by most historical accounts, in a state of significant physical decline by his late 50s. He fathered his son and heir, Hideyori, at the age of 57, which was considered remarkable at the time. But the quality of his decision-making in the final years of his life was erratic in ways that historians have attributed to the deterioration of his physical and mental health. He died at 62. His heir was 5 years old. The succession collapsed. The civil war Hideyoshi had spent his life trying to prevent happened anyway, and Ieyasu won it. Oda Nobunaga, the brutal and brilliant military genius, whose conquests Hideyoshi had built upon, and Ieyasu had built upon after that, died at 49, assassinated, but had been showing signs of the extreme stress and physical depletion that came with his particular style of leadership for years before his death. Nobunaga burned things. He made enemies without constraint. He operated at a level of sustained intensity that produced extraordinary short-term results and was not compatible with longevity. His dietary habits are less well documented than Ieyasu's, but what exists suggests a man who ate and drank as his passion dictated rather than as maintenance required. These comparisons matter because they illustrate a pattern. The men who burned brightest tended to burn out. The man who maintained himself, who managed his energy rather than spending it all at once, outlasted them and then built something more durable on the ruins of what they had created and destroyed. Now here is the part that the historical record documents with a specificity that tells us something important about how Edo period Japanese medicine actually worked in practice. The physicians who served Ieyasu were not passive attendants waiting to be called when something went wrong. They were active participants in the management of his health across decades, keeping records that functioned as something we might recognize as longitudinal medical documentation. These records survive in fragmentary form, but are sufficiently detailed to tell us several things. First, that his physicians monitored what they called his kidney energy on a regular basis, using pulse diagnosis and other observational methods that were the standard clinical tools of Chinese-influenced Japanese medicine. The concept of kidney energy, shenqi in Chinese, did not map onto kidney function in the modern physiological sense, but rather described a complex of observable characteristics, including vitality, resilience, libido, reproductive capacity, and recovery from physical exertion. Physicians could observe it declining and could make recommendations for its restoration, and Ieyasu's records suggest that this monitoring was a regular part of the management of his health rather than something that happened only when he was ill. Second, that his physicians recommended specific foods and preparations at specific stages of his life in response to what they observed. The reishi tea that he consumed regularly was likely prescribed rather than simply preferred. The particular emphasis on shellfish during certain periods appears in the medical records rather than only in the household food records. The physicians were not simply treating disease when it arrived. They were managing a system they were trying to keep in optimal condition for as long as possible, using the dietary tools available to them as the primary intervention rather than the last resort. Third, and perhaps most striking from a modern perspective, that his physicians understood something about the relationship between emotional state and physical vitality that modern medicine spent much of the 20th century pretending was irrelevant before rediscovering it as psychoneuroimmunology in the latter part of the century. The Edo period Japanese medical concept that the heart and the kidney interacted in ways that either supported or undermined each other that chronic emotional disturbance depleted physical reserves, and that physical depletion in turn produced emotional instability, anticipated by several centuries the well-documented modern understanding that psychological stress has measurable physiological consequences, and that physiological exhaustion produces measurable psychological effects. Ieyasu's physicians recommended practices that we would now classify as stress management alongside the dietary recommendations: structured rest, contemplative activities, time in nature. The falconry that appears repeatedly in the historical record was not merely recreation. It was prescribed activity because his physicians understood that a man who spent his days managing the political pressures of governing a newly unified country needed interventions that interrupted the cycle of chronic stress and allowed the body's recovery systems to operate. This brings us to perhaps the most interesting aspect of Edo period Japanese medicine in general, which is how it managed the relationship between the extraordinary and the ordinary. Western medicine of the same period was largely focused on dramatic interventions, bleeding, purging, the aggressive application of preparations that were intended to drive disease out of the body through sheer pharmaceutical force. Japanese medicine, deeply influenced by the Chinese tradition, was more interested in the conditions that kept disease from arriving in the first place. The concept at the center of this approach was something that translated roughly as cultivating life. Yojo. It encompassed everything that contributed to the maintenance of health over time: diet, sleep, movement, emotional regulation, the timing of activities in relation to the seasons, and the management of the body's energy across the full arc of a human life. A physician who practiced yojo was not primarily an emergency responder. He was more like a gardener, attending to the conditions that allowed something to grow well over time, removing obstacles to health rather than fighting the dramatic consequences of health's absence. Ieyasu embodied this approach in the way he lived, not because he was unusually virtuous or disciplined in some abstract sense, but because he was unusually pragmatic. He had watched men destroy their bodies with the tools that power made available, and he had observed the outcomes. He made different choices not out of philosophical commitment to moderation, but out of the strategic calculation that a body maintained would serve him longer than a body spent. He was right, and the Edo period medical tradition that shaped how his physicians thought gave him both the framework and the practical tools to translate that calculation into daily practice. Now, 400 years later, the scientific apparatus of modern medicine has been working its way toward the same conclusions by entirely different routes. The Blue Zones research, conducted by the writer and researcher Dan Buettner, beginning in the early 2000s, identified 5 geographic regions where people consistently lived to 100 and beyond at rates that far exceeded global averages. Sardinia in Italy, Okinawa in Japan, Loma Linda in California, the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, and Ikaria in Greece. Researchers studied these populations intensively, trying to identify what they had in common that explained their extraordinary longevity. The convergent findings were striking in their consistency across cultures that had developed entirely independently of each other. All 5 populations ate diets that were predominantly plant-based, with animal protein playing a supporting rather than starring role, and with fish and legumes as the primary protein sources where animal protein appeared at all. All 5 populations ate fermented foods as a regular part of daily life. All 5 populations embedded physical activity in the routine of daily life, rather than separating it into dedicated exercise sessions. All 5 populations had strong social structures that provided connection and purpose across the full span of life. And all 5 populations ate to approximately 80% of capacity rather than to fullness. The Okinawan population, the one most geographically and culturally proximate to Edo period Japan, ate a diet in the mid-20th century. Before the influence of Western food had significantly changed traditional patterns, that would have been recognizable to the physicians who served Tokugawa Ieyasu, sweet potato as the primary carbohydrate instead of rice, in the Okinawan case, but otherwise the structural similarities were clear. Miso, seaweed, tofu, small fish, fermented vegetables, very little meat, very little processed food, and hara-hachi-bu, the 80% rule, which Okinawan elders still recite as the principle that governs how much to eat at every meal. The telomere research is worth discussing here, because it connects the Blue Zone's observations to the molecular mechanisms that produce them. Telomeres are the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, structures that shorten over time as cells divide, and that serve as a kind of biological clock measuring cellular age. When telomeres become too short, the cell can no longer divide normally, and it enters a state of dysfunction that contributes to the aging process and to age-related diseases. The factors that accelerate telomere shortening are by this point extremely well documented: chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, elevated cortisol from sustained psychological stress, poor sleep, a diet high in processed foods, sugar, and inflammatory fats. And the factors that slow telomere shortening, or in some cases appear to lengthen telomeres, are the mirror image of this list: a diet rich in antioxidants from whole plants, omega-3 fatty acids from fish and seeds, adequate sleep, management of psychological stress, regular moderate physical activity, social connection. These are the exact parameters that Blue Zone's populations optimize for, and they are the exact parameters that Tokugawa Ieyasu optimized for, using the conceptual vocabulary of Chinese-influenced Japanese medicine rather than molecular biology, arriving at the same practical conclusions by an entirely different path. The testosterone research of the past 2 decades has been equally clarifying. The progressive decline in testosterone levels in aging men, a decline that produces reduced muscle mass, reduced bone density, reduced cardiovascular efficiency, reduced cognitive sharpness, and reduced reproductive capacity, is not, it turns out, primarily driven by age. It is primarily driven by the accumulated effects of poor diet, inadequate sleep, chronic stress, insufficient physical activity, and excessive body fat. Men who optimize these factors maintain testosterone levels significantly above their age cohort. Men who do not decline at rates that make them physiologically older than their chronological age would suggest. Zinc is required for testosterone synthesis at the enzymatic level. The oysters and shellfish that Ieyasu's physicians prescribed as kidney tonics are the richest dietary sources of zinc known to exist. The sleep that Ieyasu prioritized while his contemporaries stayed up drinking is the period during which the greatest proportion of daily testosterone production occurs. The physical activity that Ieyasu maintained through regular falconry and walking, activity that maintained muscle mass and reduced body fat, is the category of behavior most strongly associated with preserved testosterone levels in older men. The reishi mushroom tea that he consumed regularly has been shown to modulate cortisol levels in ways that protect against the cortisol-testosterone antagonism that accelerates hormonal decline in chronically stressed men. He was not, in any of this, doing anything magical. He was doing the things that keep the human body functioning correctly, applied with consistency across decades, in a context where most people around him were not doing those things, because the things that kept the body functioning correctly were, in many cases, less comfortable and less immediately pleasurable than the alternatives power made available. The hardest finding in all of this research, the one that is most consistently replicated and most consistently ignored, is that there are no shortcuts. The things that produce extraordinary longevity, and sustained physical vitality in the Blue Zone's populations are not dramatic interventions. They are ordinary practices maintained consistently over decades. Eating mostly plants, eating fermented food, sleeping adequately, moving regularly, managing stress through connection and purpose and time in nature. Stopping eating before you are completely full. These are not interesting findings. They are almost boring in their consistency. The researchers who keep arriving at them keep hoping to find something more exotic, some compound, or practice unique to a particular population that explains the effect and might be extracted and packaged and sold without requiring the person to actually change how they live. That compound or practice has not been found because it does not exist. The effect is produced by the sum of the ordinary practices, maintained over time, in a body that has been treated consistently as something worth maintaining. Tokugawa Ieyasu knew this, or rather, he lived it in the vocabulary available to him, with the result that he outlived a century of violent men, governed the country he had unified for over a decade, maintained his reproductive capacity past 60, and died at 73 of a cancer that nobody in his time could have prevented or predicted. The farmers in the fields outside Edo who ate their brown rice and their miso and their small whole fish were living the same truth accidentally, because they had no choice about how to live it. The question that history and the Blue Zone's research and the telomere biology and the testosterone studies all converge on asking is the same question. Now that you do have a choice, what are you going to put in the bowl?